Professor Lindzen, first of all, how real of a threat would you say is global warming?
It's a hard question. Personally, I don't think it's in the big leagues of threats that most people face. A lot of the alarm is based on extreme projections that, frankly, I don't think many people involved in the field seriously believe. On the other hand, I mean, given the concerns about climate, I suppose you could argue that there is something to be careful about, not even having to do with man. Climate's always changing. So we've always adapted to it, but society sometimes can adapt better. Some societies can adapt better than others. I suppose it behooves us to be in a position where whatever happens, we can deal with it.
What are your thoughts about human-induced climate change and the impact of humans on significant global warming?
Well, I think your use of the word significant is important. People don't quite realize that carbon dioxide itself is unlikely to produce a lot of warming. Moreover, what we've seen so far is even less than we would have expected carbon dioxide to have produced. And on top of that, we're by no means convinced that what we've seen over the last century is due to carbon dioxide. So on the face of it, the evidence is pretty meager. There are model predictions that suggest you get a lot of warming, but those are behaving in a curious way, and again, I don't think it's fully appreciated. In these models, CO2 seems to cause much more warming because the main greenhouse substances in the atmosphere, which are water vapor and clouds, act to take anything we do and make it much worse. I mean, you know, within this scientific community, you'd be accused of being metaphysical, but essentially the alarm is based on the notion that the Earth is very badly designed and without man's intervention would fall apart.
And you believe just the opposite of that.
Oh, I think the case is pretty strong that, in fact, it is better designed and that there are strong negative feedbacks that will, instead of amplify, diminish the effect of man's emissions.
So you believe the Creator knew what He was doing when He created the Earth?
I won't go out on a limb on the Creator or so on, but, you know, how shall I put it? Even if you don't believe, for instance, one of the arguments between, let's say, intelligent design and creationism and evolution is, can such well-designed things like the eye arise from evolution, or do they require intervention? The fact of the matter is both sides recognize that it's beautifully designed. With respect to climate, we're assuming it's very badly designed.
Do we have any role in climate change?
Oh, how should I put it? Once you use the word any rather than significant, then the answer almost certainly has to be yes. It may not be measurable, it may not be discernible, but as a colleague of mine at MIT pointed out long ago, you know, the fluttering of a butterfly's wing will eventually cause some perturbation in weather.
Okay. You do believe some global warming has occurred. but
Oh, yeah.
so minimal. Talk about that.
Well, so minimal is another, I mean, compared to what? We've had on the order of a half degree in a century. But the thing that you have to keep in mind is a really bad sign, I suppose, because it would be so unusual, would be if the temperature stayed constant at that level. It's always flopping around. You know, there are periods, like in the medieval period around the year 1000, when at least Europe and the North Atlantic were much warmer, and for centuries. And then it got colder, and you had the glaciers advancing for a few hundred years, and the Greenland settlement abandoned, and so on. And you had the beginning, by the way, of famines at that time. You know, and that lasted till the 19th century. And ever since then, glaciers have been retreating, and it's been getting a little warmer. But it's, you know, in the level of a few tenths of a degree we're talking about. I always find it astonishing when people try to disguise this by saying, oh, this is a record-breaking year, when it's 1/100th of a degree warmer and the accuracy is only a few tenths of a degree. Yeah, it's relatively small, and you know, despite Al Gore screaming about the glaciers in Greenland and so on, that's not going to come from that half degree. And yes, Alaska has warmed a couple of degrees, but northern Canada has cooled a few. That's always happening. And, you know, if you're old enough and you still have your memory, you know you've seen things change. As a kid, I remember there were hurricanes in New York every autumn. There haven't been hurricanes in New York in a while. And, you know, there have been one or two in recent decades, but it's no longer an annual event. Maybe it'll return.
Well, that brings us to this hurricane season. Advocates of global warming, they think that we're going to see, you know, more intense hurricanes, maybe even more hurricanes. What are your thoughts? What do you think we're going to see on this? What are we going to see this hurricane season?
As somebody once said, I don't know if it was Niels Bohr or Yogi Berra, prediction is very hard, especially when it deals with the future. The NOAA forecast is for an above-average hurricane season, but fewer intense hurricanes than last season. The scale of these forecasts is not overwhelming, but it does look like we're returning to the pattern of the 40s and 50s and 30s, which were more hurricanes.
Is this a result of global warming?
Wasn't before. I don't see why it should be now. I mean, it would be as though without global warming the world would have stopped dead in 1960. That seems implausible. We've had this before. I mean, as far as the Arctic goes, it's still the case, I think. 1939 was the peak temperature.
As far as in the 20th century, 1939?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that an exceptional time as far as for industry output and emissions and all that you recall?
No, and you know, you're not responding to emissions, you're responding to the amount in the air. And the amount in the air at that time was still relatively small.
Okay. What about sea level rise? What's your thoughts on sea level rise? Are we going to see more of that in the future?
Well,
because of global warming?
Oh, that's another qualification. We've seen sea level rise at a fairly steady rate for the last 12,000 years, 18,000 years, as the Ice Age ended.
So you don't think it can be pinned on global warming?
Well, it is, in a sense. We got warmer after the end of the last Ice Age. But, I mean, so there has been melting. You know, it's on the order of what is it, a centimeter a decade. I'll get caught short if I have the wrong number, but it's a small amount. It's hard to measure. It's also relatively small compared to the normal sea level changes at any given location. Let's say the largest changes in sea level at any given location tend to be due to tectonics, to the Earth moving up and down relative to the sea. And one reason it's hard to measure the steady secular rise is it's such a small residual. There's no evidence of acceleration of this.
So what the alarmists, as you call them, are saying, is what they're preaching, so to speak, is this an unproven phenomenon? Is this junk science?
I don't want to get into name-calling on this, but yeah, sure. I mean, there's nothing happening in the sea level rise that would warrant a statement we're heading into something new.
I mean, overall, what the alarmists are saying, just as far as global warming.
At the beginning, I mean, the reason they picked this is to tell somebody they're going to see a half-degree increase in temperature. That doesn't have much power. I mean, that's the only thing we're really talking about seriously. And people know they have vastly more than that between day and night and spring and fall and summer and winter. And so what's the big deal? So I think the sea level rise from the beginning 20 years ago was picked because it was good for videos. It gave you a visual and people could respond to it. But it had nothing to do with it being a real problem.
So would you call it junk science then, what's being preached on the other side?
I would say it is intentionally alarming.
Why is it intentionally alarming? Why are we seeing this?
Well, in some ways your guess may be as good as mine. I mean, I've looked at the history of it. I think it started, how shall I put it, innocently enough. I mean, you know, it probably was some lab directors and administrators who thought, how could they get a bigger piece of the pie for climate studies? And there's always a tendency to oversell these things a bit. But I don't think anyone quite anticipated it would have that resonance with certain politicians that it has had. And so I think the whole thing got out of hand. By now, I mean, you have at least one political party that's committed to one side of this issue and treating, you know, anyone who questions it as a flat earther or a Holocaust denier or who knows what. And so they've intimidated a lot of people who don't understand science. But if these guys, if suddenly you were to point out that this is not a problem, it'll be embarrassing for the powers that be, and they'll want someone to blame. So the scientists probably know they'll be the ones to be blamed, and so they're sort of holding on to a tiger by the tail. I think it's just gotten very unpleasant, but...
Yeah, you even wrote last month an article called Climate of Fear. What exactly did you mean by that? Or how is this issue...
I didn't choose the title. But, no, but there is intimidation. There's no question about it. You know, even when Gore was a senator, he was chair of a committee that overlooked the funding of major science programs, major agencies, NSF, NASA, and so on. And he had already gotten on this hobby horse about global warming. And people who objected to him, I mean, he hauled them before his committee. No other senator showed up. That's absolutely unique. And just worked away to get a recantation in front of the agency heads who are funding you. And yeah, that's not a nice procedure. And moreover, the professional societies, you know, felt so indebted to his interest that nobody stood up and bailed you out. The only person who actually came close to standing up and saying this is not the way to go was Ted Koppel, who Gore had asked to dig up dirt on anyone who questioned Gore's science. And Koppel objected on the air and ran a program on, you know, what the argument was about. But there's no question that Gore was not just asking Ted Koppel. I mean, he's made it a personal crusade. I mean, one of the most idiotic parts of it was he always refers to a man called Roger Revelle, who had been a professor at Harvard and who first told him about increasing CO2 in a class. Now, Roger Revelle always, to his dying day, felt it was interesting to see what would happen, but he was far from an alarmist. And indeed, he contributed to an article a year or so before he died, saying that it was much too uncertain to engage in any particular mitigation efforts. And one of Gore's flunkies actually tried to sue someone to take Roger Revelle's name off that article. Or not sue, but he kept doing. The person who he did this to did sue and win.
Wow.
But that's a tedious procedure.
Okay. I wanted to refer to that article that you wrote. You write in here, but there is a more sinister side to this feeding frenzy. Scientists who dissent from the alarmism have seen their grant funds disappear, their work derided, and themselves libeled as industry stooges, scientific hacks, or worse.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's standard. I mean, a man called Ross Gelbspan has made a career for himself, calling names, attributing everything, any unusual weather event to global warming. I mean, it's interesting. You can make a career out of that. And he is forever claiming the only reason anyone objects to hysteria is their hood ornaments on the misinformation vehicle of the fuel industry.
Would you say the global warming issue is being used by some to gain political power?
Certainly to gain influence. I mean, it's a bureaucrat's dream. And if you control CO2, what don't you control? After all, we're producing CO2 right now by breathing. So, yeah, it has its attractions. But also, I mean, it's become the flagship of the environmental movement, and that has its own political ramifications. And it's based on a rather peculiar worldview that the world is extremely fragile. And as I said, it's based on the notion that it's intentionally fragile in the sense that it'll do anything we do and make it worse, and it can't survive unless they arrange it so.
Well, what's happened to you? How have you experienced the climate of fear because of your opinions?
Well, I would say not too much, and I can explain why. When the issue first broke, a number of us who had senior positions and had tenure and were reasonably secure and for whom it didn't matter if funding were lost, openly questioned it. And this included people like Bill Nierenberg, who had been director of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and Jerry Namias, who had been head of NOAA's long-range forecasting, and Fred Zeitz, who had been president of Rockefeller University and the National Academy, all opposed it. The trouble, and Hubert Lamb, who was Europe's foremost climate scientist, and I could name numerous others. The trouble is, we were old. I was one of the younger. And a lot of them are dead now.
Have you been ridiculed for your beliefs?
Oh, sure. Sure. I mean, just go to the web. I mean, I've been accused of being a Nazi. I've been accused of being a shill. Laurie David, who is producing Gore's movie, has a web blog attacking me as being of no consequence, and she's fortunately she wasn't right, but she was expressing glee that I'm finally losing my funding. It was disgraceful that I had any. This is what happens, frankly, when an issue becomes politicized.
And you have lost funding then because of this?
I wouldn't say so, and it's very hard always to tell. I've spun down. I still have funding for what I want. I'm a theoretician. Theoretician doesn't need much funding.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also most of my funding over the years has been for what's called dynamic meteorology, which isn't explicitly concerned with global warming. I have rarely applied for funding based on global warming.
Why are we seeing such strong emotions over this, where there's entire blogs devoted to belittling
I
you?
know. That's astonishing. But I think that's very much the nature of politics. I mean, for instance, why are there such strong emotions among Red Sox fans or any other ball team? I think when things get into politics, I mean, you know, look at the last election, 2004, the hatred that was exuded over people doing their job. You know, it was their team versus some other team. I can't explain it beyond that. Because clearly, people don't understand the issue who are emoting in this way. And the people who wanted to promote alarm from the beginning, I mean, 1988 Newsweek, they said all scientists agree. And the purpose of that is to sort of intimidate most people who don't know about science. Because once you say all scientists agree, then, you know, you don't want to be looking stupid. You don't agree, so you say, I agree, I agree. And even for scientists, if it's not their field, if they're told all people in one field agree, you know, out of collegiality, they'll go along. So you get a huge amplification of the agreement without any core except your propaganda.
Well, that says a lot about you, that you're willing to go against the grain and stick to your guns, so to speak.
Well, you know, how shall I put it? It may be stupid, to be honest, but still, I've been working in this subject for a long time. One of the attractions of it is it has great problems. I mean, we still don't know why we had these ice age cycles. We don't know why 50 million years ago you could have alligators in Spitsbergen. It's just a wonderful area, and this is killing it in a way. It's saying, you know, you have these wonderful problems, and instead of answering them, you're going to make believe it's all due to CO2.
And even back in the 70s, scientists were predicting a global cooling.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you know, it's this funny interaction of scientists with environmentalists, with politicians, that can turn speculations into alarm, because that's used for fundraising, and when people get alarmed, they ask their politicians to do something. So they do something whether it makes any sense or not. I mean, Kyoto is a good example of that. I think the scientific community pretty much agrees. Kyoto will do nothing for climate. But it's a natural response of politicians. They're told, do something, they'll do something.
Okay. Well, are you going to continue to me, when I see you, you're standing by your beliefs?
Well, we're working on stuff. I don't think, to be fair, I mean, I think there's a realm for belief, but this isn't one of them. So to ask a question, do you believe in global warming or don't you, is to take what is a scientific question and turn it into a religious question. And it's been done a lot. I mean, one reason I think people react so strongly may be that, you know, there's a constant quest among people for what I call cheap virtue. You know, how can I be held to be a good person with a minimum of effort? And saying, I care about the environment. I care about global warming, for a lot of people, has been their claim to virtue. If you argue against it, you're attacking their claim to virtue. You know, for scientists it's trickier, but it's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of inquiry. And we're continuing.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Talk about a little bit more. I mean, you say this has been turned into a religious issue, excuse me, in sheep virtue. But what I'm getting from you is that the science is on your side.
Well, I think a lot of people in the scientific community would quibble about that. But I think it is. And we're continuing to research it. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work on pinning down these feedbacks. And I'm virtually convinced at this stage that the clouds exert a very powerful negative feedback, and would pretty much constrain the warming due to man to under about a half degree by the year 2100. And I don't think anyone is suggesting that would be the end of the world. To be frank, I don't think even 2 degrees would be the end of the world. I mean, people have adjusted readily to many more things. I mean, running through almost all the international studies of the horrible things they would propose might happen is a picture of mankind that doesn't make sense. I mean, you know, it's sometimes referred to as the dumb farmer assumption, that if a farmer is growing a particular strain of wheat and the temperature changes, he'll continue raising the same wheat and let it fail. Farmers don't behave that way. People don't behave that way in general. Ever since we invented the umbrella, we've known how to deal with climate up to a point, and we're much better able to do it now than we were. So, you know, desertification is a real problem in much of the world, regardless of man-made climate change. But, you know, you go to Israel, and they know how to deal with desertification and turn it into useful agricultural land. So I'm not particularly concerned that we'll be stymied by 1 or 2 degrees, and a half degree I think almost no one will notice.
Okay. Also, I want to talk about, too, the theory that, well, with global warming, there's a reduction in temperature between the equator and the poles. And some believe, I want to talk about that, and then I also want to talk about the evaporation theory somehow causing more storms. Talk first about the reduction in temperature.
Okay.
That actually would mean less storms, correct? Talk about that.
Well, where we live, between about 30 degrees north and the pole, storms usually are generated by the temperature gradient between the tropics and the pole. And it's elementary textbook material. I mean, this is not anything that is contested. Reducing that temperature difference ought to reduce the intensity and excitation of storms. Also, temperature variability is due to whether the wind is blowing from the north or the south. And if the temperature difference between the two is less, you'll have less variability. And there's nothing contested about that, but it doesn't sound alarming. So you have people saying, well, we'll have much more storminess. Well, there's nothing in our knowledge base that tells us that, but a gentleman, John Houghton, who was head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Scientific Assessment, wasn't a scientist, an engineer, but I mean, he said, oh, well, a warmer world will have more evaporation, and that'll cause more storms. Well, that is not a major factor for most storms in the north, you know, in the extratropics. And so that didn't make any sense. It could be argued in the tropics, but there are technical reasons why I would think it would not be a simple argument. To get more evaporation, that isn't strictly the issue. You need to get more intense cumulus activity. And that really, if the relative humidity stays the same, that doesn't change much in a warmer world. So you wouldn't get more of that unless the humidity went down. But then you wouldn't get the positive feedback, so that it would sort of all fall apart. A colleague of mine at MIT took a different view. He said, let's consider a hurricane as a thermodynamic engine, something called a Carnot cycle. He said, if the surface warms, you could increase the intensity of hurricanes, not their frequency. And he came out with a very controversial paper that said that if you relate hurricanes to the underlying temperature, as the temperature increased, there's been some evidence of an increase in intensity of hurricanes over the sea, though there was no increase of those that made landfall. Other people have argued that the data he used required adjustments bigger than his effect, and he was taking what was called the third power, multiplying it by itself, twice. Mm-hmm. And so any little change got bigger. Mm-hmm. That's, arguable. But, Time magazine then said, well, he predicted Katrina, and he would be the first to deny that there's any way of associating Katrina with global warming. I have other objections to it. When they just look at temperature, they're not distinguishing the temperature itself from the fact that a high temperature is usually a maximum. And that means there are steep gradients on the side, and air is flowing into that region. And the reason I think that's likely to be the case is you have the warmest body of water on the Earth is the Bay of Bengal. And in the 70s, there were ferocious tropical cyclones there. We haven't had them in recent years. And so, even though that has gotten a bit warmer, there's been no associated increase in, they call it cyclones, we call it hurricanes.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the IPCC? Advocates of global warming, they periodic or many times refer to the science coming from that organization. What do you think about the IPCC?
Look, I contributed to the first three, and I was a lead author on the third. It's a funny sort of operation. I mean, it's a little bit tilted. I wouldn't say it's phenomenally tilted. The worst thing about it is you go around the Earth 2-3 times, traveling from meeting to meeting, to write 2 pages. It's a kind of waste of time. And so I think a lot of people on both sides of the issue don't want to participate because they have better things to do. So it tends to be, on the whole, not a quality operation. The second thing is it's the United Nations. And so there aren't too many countries with outstanding research teams.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Garbage day.
Yeah.
We're running out of time here as far as lighting goes.
Okay.
The sun knows no.
Yeah, I can't stop the sun.
Right.
You were talking about the UN and the IPCC.
Yeah. Well, the UN, of course, requires representation from as many nations as possible. That guarantees the IPCC is heavily filled with people from areas that don't have strong research efforts. It's not, I would say, it is.
In the middle of a busy city like this is very nice.
Well, this place is not so busy.
Yeah. Okay. You wanted to say a little bit more about the UN and the IPCC.
Yeah. So you have a lot of representation from countries that do not have much in the way of an effort. But nevertheless, you take a little field like climate science, and it is a little field, and it's not a strong field. That is to say, the towering figures in science didn't work in climate, to be honest. And all of a sudden you have a guy in some small country, and the IPCC rates him among thousands of the world's leading scientists. So it's very flattering, and he'll want to help out, and he'll be very loyal to the IPCC. But that said, the document itself, it's not terrible. I remember when I was working on it, I mean, 2 pages, and there were 3 people. And the ground rule we adopted was, that we should not say anything that's overtly wrong. And I thought, stuck to that. And the text was okay. I mean, it was tilted a little bit in favor of models. There's a limit to how much you could criticize them, even though they're not successful, but still.
Yeah.
But when you take these documents, then you have another group write a summary, and the summary rather profoundly distorts what's in the document. It has a very different feel. Even that is filled with weasel words. This might be, this could be as much as. And they know of a certainty that politicians and advocates in the environmental movement will take it could be and turn it into it is predicted to be, it will be, and so on. And so you have this very unwholesome, what I refer to as triangle, where scientists make vague but suggestive remarks, and you have advocates who turn them into alarming statements and claim all scientists agree with them. And then you have politicians who respond by giving money to the scientists, and the whole thing develops a kind of closed but amplifying nature. That's not particularly healthy.
Well, there was a quote from Larry Schweiger. He's the CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. Do you know Larry?
No.
Okay. And he said, actually in an interview with me, there's a tremendous amount of evidence actually in favor of global warming. This is a very well-documented problem, and I don't know how people debate it because the evidence is so compelling and so overwhelming. What do you think?
I don't know what to think about that. I mean, because nobody ever says what they mean. Yeah, I think compelling, nothing in this field is terribly compelling. The data is weak. But I would say there's general agreement there's been a half-degree warming. That's plus rather than minus. So there's been warming. CO2 has gone up. And CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It'll contribute some warming. Not much. But that's as far as the agreement goes. It's then claimed scientists agree that recent changes are due to man. I don't think that's true. But there's certainly been no poll. And his statement that the evidence is so compelling you can't imagine anyone disagreeing with it, that's not true either. But if that's what the agreement is, it's not even alarming. So he must be talking about ice sheets melting and so on. There's not much evidence for that. Yeah, there's been measured more outflow from Greenland. There were previous measurements that the center is growing. It's nature of outflow. You put more on top, it'll push some off the side. That happened during the last ice age. You'd have every few hundred years, gigantic pieces of ice were pushed off North America into the ocean. They were called Donsker events. It's using normalcy to frighten people. I don't, whenever you pin someone down as to what they mean by saying there's a consensus, it's always these relatively trivial things. And yet, it gets transposed onto predictions of alarm, which don't have much to do with what there's agreement about. So, how shall I put it? When somebody says the science is settled on global warming, given the numerous ramifications of global warming, the numerous aspects of the climate, the thought that there is lockstep agreement on this, and it constitutes one issue, should immediately be a red flag that something fishy is going on. And I think I'd have to say the guy from World Wildlife is an example of that.
Okay, all right. So would you say alarm rather than genuine scientific curiosity is essential to maintain funding?
Oh, it's a pretty good way. I mean, look, when I started in science, relative to the size of the scientific community, funding was good. And the reason it was good was World War II and the A-bomb convinced the politicians that science was relevant. And in a way, they were funding science for about 20 years out of gratitude for the war contribution of science. But by the 60s, they had a bureaucracy in place, and gratitude, to be honest, is nowhere near as certain a motivation for support as is threats of danger. You know, so you have all of molecular biology supported by the war on cancer. This is unfortunately a part of the whole fundraising business. How do you get the people, the body politic, to pay special attention to your field? And unfortunately, how does somebody put it, putting a gun to someone's head is more effective than asking for their gratitude.
Okay. Would you say there's a strange reluctance to actually find out how climate really behaves?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, without taking a position on the ozone problem, the scientists working on it quickly realized that once the Montreal Convention was signed banning freons, funding stopped. I mean, unfortunately, we have a system of support for science. I think there I would be fair in saying it's stupid. The reward for solving a problem is having your funding end, because the problem is solved. There's something in the incentive structure there which is not entirely correct.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything else you want to get across about all this?
I mean, I'm content not to get anything across on it, to be honest, but if there are any other questions you have, I'd be glad to answer them.
I mean, obviously, you're willing to take the time to do this interview today, so
Sure.
you want the misconceptions cleared
look,
up.
I would love to see the atmosphere for doing climate studies and climate science cleared in my lifetime. But there's also an issue as a citizen. I think people are being manipulated, and as I think an Indian representative put it quite well, I mean, they have to worry about poverty. This isn't high on their list. They have plenty of things that really warrant worry. To devote our worry to things that aren't real is a waste of a resource, and in some ways environmentalism should be about not wasting resources.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else you want to say? Okay.
Okay.
What Stan's going to do now is going to get a couple shots of you and I communicating.
Broken down and said, okay, we go along, and we'll be stewards of our environment. The environmental movement says, you see, if these people even agree to it, it must be true, and so they become a witness to it. And that's happened time and again. CEOs do this all the time. They say, I give up. My wife wants to go to the country club and not be attacked, so we'll show our green credentials. And then immediately people turn around and say, if they're willing to agree, it must be true.
What are your thoughts about evangelicals who signed the Evangelical Climate Initiative, who have come out basically on the side of liberals on this issue?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly well meant, but I think it's profoundly misguided, and it's being used in a way that I don't think they intended. And as we've discussed, the underlying notion in climate change.
Sorry, I
Yeah, with the...
Now the wind is coming.
Okay.
That's right. Okay. We're rolling.
Okay. What are your thoughts about evangelicals who signed the Evangelical Climate Initiative, who are essentially on the side of liberals on this issue?
I'm not so concerned about them being on the side of liberals as on their being perhaps misguided and misused. I can understand the position if it's presented to someone.
Let's do that over again. I want to ask the question a little bit better.
Okay. Well, the
We got
airplane.
the plane
does.
too. What are your thoughts on evangelicals who have joined this cause?
Well, I think that they may mean well, but I think they are clearly not really aware of what the issue involves. And two, I don't think they're aware of how their position is being used by others. So, for example, we've discussed this, that underlying global warming is the notion that carbon dioxide, although it itself doesn't do much, is happening in a world that takes anything we do and makes it worse. Now, a well-engineered device tries to compensate for anything that perturbs it. The assumption here is this is a very badly engineered world. I don't think they are thinking that way. I think they're thinking in terms of stewardship, and the world is being threatened, and one should do one's best to take care of it. And that's, of course, a reasonable thing, but it's not scientifically reasonable. In addition to that, it helps get, I think, evangelicals off the hook, in a sense. I mean, they're constantly attacked in the press for creationism, for this, for that, for not being with it. And here they can be with it, and seemingly without violating their conscience. Although I think if they thought about it, they'd realize even this issue isn't free of that. But then the environmentalists and advocates use it in a totally different way. They say, look, if evangelicals agree, all of a sudden, if they agree, it must be true. And so they become witnesses and evidence, not just going along for the ride. And the same thing has happened with CEOs in major firms, oil firms, British Petroleum. They are tired of being battered as not caring about the earth. So they say, okay, we agree, all scientists agree, we'll agree too. And all of a sudden it gets used saying, well, listen, if even the CEO of British Petroleum, or Beyond Petroleum, what they're calling themselves now, agree, it must be true. So again, they are transformed into witnesses to something they don't understand, don't know, and have nothing really to do with.
So in essence, these people, you think, are misguided and are actually helping to further a political cause?
Oh yes, without doubt.
Okay. All right, anything else you want to say?